Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Scott Parker Goes Live. For those who don't know me, I've been called a covert human rights campaigner. Others, I expect, describe me more as a social entrepreneur and thought leader who invented the first business-owned disability network and has a long career persuading senior executives that treating people properly, including people with disabilities, is good for business, and then showing them how. Some argue that I have supped with the private sector devil so long, with that famous long spoon, that I have in fact gone over to the dark side. Whatever you call me, after some 30 years hacking away at this, I'm still asking the questions that I think really matter. Why is it so hard to get "and what about disability" into the ethical and responsible AI debate? Why do so many of the diversity managers who describe diversity as a choice choose not to tackle disability discrimination? And since when is treating people fairly and with respect defined as a choice? Well, I guess you could argue not robbing a bank is a choice. Why do we have health conditions and it's other people who have disabilities? And why do we just take it for granted that HR practitioners don't have a clue about the impact of disability discrimination on, well, their human resources? I don't know about you, but I expect a doctor to know the difference between your elbow and your knee. And with all that said, let's dive into this episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my conversation with Lesa Bradshaw. Lesa and I met ages ago when she was based in South Africa, but she's very much based in Europe now. So thank you for joining me. And I'm going to introduce you after you introduce yourself. So how did I meet you? Who are you? Why are you in Europe? What's it all about?
Let me give you a 1 minute on high overview. So Susan and I met at a conference where our eyes locked on stage, and we were there talking about disability confidence in an event in Amsterdam.
Amsterdam, yeah.
Yeah, and we had a moment where there was someone spouting off about the corporate great intentions, but there was no actions to back it. We both looked at each other and thought, okay, we're going to have to do some work here. And I think we had a fairly short time to project our conversations. But afterwards we got chatting, and I think that started a very long allyship that has led us all the way through my life in Africa and converting to my life in the UK. So I'm a social entrepreneur from South Africa originally. I own a company called Bradshaw LeRoux Consulting there, and we do everything to do with building disability confidence in the economy. My organization still runs there. It still very much is doing a lot of work in the African context. I then, through personal circumstance, had an opportunity to move to the UK. There was a treatment made available for me for my disability that was available here. So it was a bit of a quick, no-brainer conversation. And next minute, I was living in Devon, which, yeah, I've started up Lesa Bradshaw International here, where I'm using my experiences from a global and, the South African developed country perspective, and I'm bringing it to conversations in Europe, America, and the UK. And that's what I'm doing right now.
Well, I'm thinking back, of course it was Amsterdam. It was that huge conference. And actually our eyes locked because we had someone with a disability on the platform talking about how inspirational she was. She was introduced as inspirational, and she went on about how inspirational she was. And I remember looking over at you because we were both going to be on the platform after her. And you made a face and I made a face. And then you went up and said, actually, I'm not inspirational. Sitting in your wheelchair. And I think the audience really started to pay attention at that point. But it also reminds me that in our conversations about your experiences in South Africa, you've made it very clear that you're at a disadvantage there. And so I wanted to ask you straight out, why does being disabled, why does being a woman, why does being a social entrepreneur in South Africa, why is that regarded as not enough? Why don't you fit somehow in terms of how that country is really promoting equality on so many fronts?
Oh, right. I think it's got to do with the fact that I'm missing one of the tick box factors, and that is that I'm not Black. And now in South Africa, Black means broad-based Black. It means anything that's not white. So obviously coming out of apartheid, there's a lot of work being done on promoting the rights of people that had systemically been excluded from our economy, from our society, from education, and so on. And so in its grateful and positive intention, we created this triple BEE, which is a broad-based Black economic equity or empowerment program. And companies need to align to that. And it means that by promoting people that were previously disadvantaged in your recruitment, in your selection, in your skills development, you get recognized through scorecard points. If you don't get the points, you get in trouble. If you do get the points, you can continue with business and you can get awarded contracts and so on. But you only count if you have the black tick as well. So in terms of scorecard points, I am a 100% owned business by a woman with a disability. The work that I do is for profit, but it is a social entrepreneurship. So I create social positive impacts, but I don't get any points at all because I'm missing the one melatonin feature that I should have. So the intention of the legislation is to promote it, but they got confused and they've clumped all of the isms together into one point structure. And unless you have all of the isms, you don't, and by isms, racism, sexism, and ableism, you know, you've got to have the full package to be recognized.
But if you care about talent, and so many companies say they care about talent, is there some sort of an inherent tension between having to have the right tick boxes ticked and your quest for talent? Because presumably Lesa Bradshaw as being the very best at whatever it is Lesa Bradshaw does wouldn't matter if you're trying to fill in the boxes. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. It's very frustrating because, you know, the reality is there's that people are who are Black or young or, you know, have disabilities. They have been completely, in reality, systemically excluded. So I can see that if we're going quantitatively, if you start to give a lot more money to investing in Black females who are young with a disability, you know, you're going to hone into this target of people that have been quite significantly excluded. But the consequence of these programs is that when we only invest in young Black talent with or without a disability, we exclude other forms of individuals from programs, and we start to go for putting these individuals in positions that can give us the best points. So I'll tell you what that means in practice from a talent acquisition point of view. In my recruitment division in my company in South Africa, if I go back to 20 years ago when we started it, we were promoting, give us your vacancies and we'll fill them. And we'll fill them with talent with a disability. That was our promise. That was our positioning. If I go, and then they introduced this thing called the learnership system, which is companies get extra tax rebates and extra points if they upskill people with disabilities who are young and Black. They've got to be under 32, Black, and with a disability. They get lots of extra points. So suddenly companies are going, well, it's actually better for us to put people in these learnerships than it is for us to actually recruit them because we get more points. And so if I go fast forward 20 years, 98% of the vacancies that we get in our business is for Black youth with disabilities called learnerships. We don't actually get vacancies. And so when I engage with companies and I go, well, you know, we focus on finding talent with disabilities and getting them in your business. They go, oh, we've already got a learnership program. We don't need any more. We've got the full count.
And so when they have a learnership program, that means somebody comes in for a few months and then leaves and they never see them again.
Well, the idea of a learnership is smart. It's designed to go, well, it's a 70-30% thing. So 30% of your year, we will train you theoretically on a certification, a recognized certification. And for 7 months of that year, you must be getting actual work experience. But that's not actually how it happens, because companies go, well, if I calculate back the tax numbers and the scorecard points and the figures, I need 100 Black young women with a disability, but we can't obviously take them in our business. So we'll outsource them. So what happens is you get an external service provider that goes, well, we'll give them simulated work experience so they can sit at home, they can do their qualification, but they're not learning about things like the realities of getting to work every day on time, being part of a team, where you are relied on, and there's an accountability structure where you can see what your career looks like and you know what you're aiming and striving for. So the reality is that we've got this whole bunch of people with disabilities in these learnership structures who aren't actually getting work experience. So they're not accessing that network that they need to get that first shot opportunity to be meaningfully employed. And it's reflected. If you go and have a look at the quantitative stats of how many people with disabilities are being employed in permanent roles, it hasn't changed over the last 26 years. In fact, it's got worse. So our system is not working.
It's fascinating. However, many people would argue, well, it's just South Africa, right? It's unique to the history and so on of South Africa. But of course, as I'm listening to, I'm hearing that corporations get into these positions where their attempts to comply with local legislation actually gets in the way of accessing the right people for the right jobs, of productivity, and even a sense of fairness. That you're recruiting people in a way that respects their individual contribution, you're being flexible and so on. But the compliance culture is a problem worldwide. You have so many companies around the world who notice that the law says they have to make reasonable adjustments or accommodations for people with disabilities. And then they shift in compliance cultures to that's kind of special treatment for people who can prove they're disabled enough to trigger a legal obligation to, in my words, treat them fairly. Because of course you make reasonable adjustments so that you treat people fairly. What are you seeing as you look now with your business in the UK and focused on the European ecosystem? Is there a problem with a kind of compliance culture here too, even though it takes a different shape than what you've described in South Africa?
Yeah. Look, again, I was quite saddened to see that in many countries in Europe, there's still this obsession with having to prove a disability before you treat it fairly. And I think the compliance culture breeds that, because if it goes, you've got a quantitative target of how many people with disabilities you have to employ. Then our next natural logical question is, okay, so what is a disabled person? So then we define it. And then we get these fantastic definitions, which I'm still quite flawed by. Whereas I go country to country and I go, what is your definition? That it inspired me to just release a podcast recently. And it was about going, really imagine we were in this world where we go, well, we want gender parity. So we want women to come and take over leadership roles. But in order to prove you're a woman, we must do an estrogen count. And only if you're above a certain estrogen level shall we deem you as a woman, and then you may come and show and help us get gender parity. Imagine it came to race, when we go, well, you've got to have a count of a certain melatonin level before we consider you to be broad-based Black, in which case then you can qualify. And that seems absurd. And yet that's exactly what we do with disability. So we go, well, yes, you say you've got a disability, but do you really? Well, I don't know. Let's see if we can prove it. And it's not enough for you to go, well, here's how it disables me. This is the barriers that I'm facing. And this is how I would be more productive, engaged, and capable if we remove those disabling barriers, which is good for your business and good for me. We don't do that. We go, well, now a doctor must verify. And they must first have a look at you. And what I'm finding in different countries, they've got different ways that you've got to go and prove it. You've got to be more than 50% disabled. Well, who on earth decides that? To me, it's like getting a tape measure and measuring your smile and going, well, you're only happy if your smile is more than 6%. It's a lived experience. It's not a quantitative measure. So I think what's happened is any compliance-based conversation in business, there's the reality of, well, we have to reach this quantitative target, and it stands to reason that we then need to do a head count. So anybody in our business got a disability? Can you put your hand up? And those who are brave enough to go, well, yeah, the risk of all stigmas and stereotypes and assumptions, pick me. We go, okay, now can you please go through these many hoops to prove that that is true? And then once you've proven that, we'll go, oh, well, now you need special treatment, but we don't have budget for that. So I'm sorry, that's not going to work for us. So, if you really want to take stock of how many people with disabilities are in your business, start by asking really meaningful questions. Like, if you have a disability and you've asked for an adjustment, have you been given it? And if not, Why not? And is it working for you? And is it helping you be more productive? What can we do better? You know, that for me is the data we should be collecting, not hands up so we can count.
Well, and of course, you're relating to those targets. There are employment quotas in so many countries, not just across Europe,
Yes.
established as a World War I public policy initiative. And so my frustration is watching companies trying to get consistent best practice in every country in which they operate,
Yeah.
but they come up against having to send people to doctors in Germany to
Yes.
get proof that you have, you're 50% disabled according to a medical diagnosis. And it triggers unintended side effects, including, of
Yes.
course, you lose good people. You
Yeah.
lose, you're sending out a message that I'm only going to treat you properly if I have to,
Yes.
because the quota distorts that. And yet it's the companies who get the blame when
Yes.
the disability lobby says, why aren't you hiring disabled people?
Yeah.
Rather than a public policy which actively gets in the way. I guess we probably shouldn't talk about quotas. I could do a 3-hour little rant about what goes wrong with quotas, but I wanted to come back to the work that you've been doing in Europe. So in the context of the confusion about who really has a disability and not understanding that you make adjustments so you treat people fairly and you only make reasonable ones by definition. Yeah. What are you doing with particular organizations? How do you tackle that when a company comes to you to say, how do we do better than we've been doing on this subject over the past few years?
Yeah. I think for me, there's two elements that I believe that I can really, bring real value. The first thing is companies need a benchmark because they need to know how they're progressing. And so, for example, the ILO self-assessment, you start off with going, how do you think you're doing? And let's get a sense of your level of disability confidence. And once we get a measure of that, this is not a judgment piece. This is a self-reflection. This helps us understand what we need to be doing differently. We've completely forgotten, for example, to ask our customers what they need. Hadn't even thought about that. We've only been focusing on putting ramps in buildings because, that's what we think accessibility looks like. So it's really just starting by letting organizations see that this is not we're accommodating for an individual with a disability. How do we do that? But rather we're learning from disability to design better for everybody. And this is how we learn. And this is how we evolve into that business that it's part of our DNA. The second thing that I think is important to recognize is that, particularly for global businesses, what I find is a lot of the strategies and plans and policies that are put in place in the UK, for example, if your head office is in UK and you've got these global strategies, but now try and translate those into a small division of yours in Latin America or in South Africa, where we've got a different talent pipeline. We've got different systemic barriers that prevent people from being able to work. For example, in South Africa, the transport system, there is no accessible public transport system. End of story. So getting to work and back is a completely different story to doing so in the UK, where you've got an accessible public transport system. So there are realities in your territories or your regions that make your policy difficult to translate into action. And so one thing, given my experience on sort of the different corners of the world, is saying, how do we take your global intention and translate that into an actionable that will respond to removing the disabling barriers in context? And so, that's a lot of it where I'm focusing. I've got a series where I call it, if I could summarize what I do, it's moving the narrative from special to equal. That's really it, and that's what I'm trying to do using my lived experiences, both within growing up in South Africa, where there were no accessibility resources, to being in the UK and Europe, where you've got the resources, but we're not leveraging them correctly or properly, that it translates to great employees and great employment stories.
Have you found any companies at all that you think have good stories to tell that are starting to really motor on this?
Yeah. I'd like to name drop and just give kudos to Beiersdorf, an organization I've been working with over the last year and a half. I can honestly tell you, I've never seen a company start so humble and go, we really don't know how to do this. And we're not professing to know, but we want to know. And so we started off with challenging the C-suite, and we gave them their own products and services, products. And we said, you know, your target market with anti-wrinkle cream is people that are older than 45, you know, and you can't read the label, or you can't do this, or you can't do. And they were so open to going, gosh, you know, we need to be speaking to our customers. But beyond that, so they saw straight away the penny drop that this is not just about accommodating for our employees with disabilities. This is understanding a whole market that we actually serve and how to do business better. But followed by that was just a genuine enthusiasm about learning. So it wasn't this is how we're going to do it. It was like, what do you need to do it better? And so the numerous connections that they made with their people to say, you know, tell us what some of your true fears are. We did a series called You Can't Ask That, where line managers were encouraged to send their questions anonymously. That we, you know, like, well, what if they can't perform? What do we do? What if we can't accommodate? And we answered those raw questions to say, don't panic, you know, we've got your back, and this is what it's about, and this is a way to rethink it. So it's just the authenticity of the conversations and the narrative that started to happen. But most importantly for me was how it was converted into actions in what they do. So they got suppliers involved in how do we make our packaging more adaptive? What do our customers need? In marketing, how do we reflect this and invite this in our customers to come and be part of these conversations? So they're on a journey. They're not there yet. They acknowledge they're not there yet. We're now working at how do we make it relevant to territories as well. But the genuine, authentic, this is not a new skill we're learning. It's just taking the skills we've already got in our brands and in our values, which is we genuinely care about what the impact we're creating. And that's how we're going to measure this experience. So even though they have quotas in various areas of the world, they go, if you want to disclose a disability, it doesn't matter or not whether or not you align to some definition. Tell us what's disabling you, so we know what to do to enhance, you know, your productivity and your experience.
And of course, what I like about that approach is that if you provide adjustments for someone who is only 30% disabled, according to a doctor in Germany, even though you're not legally required to do so, everybody wins, because gradually you make adjustments routinely, and even the people who are 50%, according to some local law, will get their adjustments. But it's the company lifting above inconsistent and always inadequate local law by having a standard that actually aligns with a basic understanding of equality. I really like the way you used the word equality, because we are so everywhere trying to get away from the idea this is special treatment for some people instead of everyone getting to the point where they're being treated with dignity and on an equal basis. And that includes, of course, the insight that disabled people have the same right to be fired on the grounds of poor performance as anybody else.
Absolutely.
You know? And that's when you know you're talking to a disability confident manager, as he's going to take the risk of hiring someone, which is always a high risk thing when you hire anybody. It's like getting married, right? I'm going to take the risk of hiring you, Lesa, because I know that if it doesn't work out, I can send you home, right? 100%. I don't have to keep you forever just because you have a disability, any more than I have to keep Susan forever because she's Canadian. I mean, imagine
100%.
that. 100%. And so I wanted to come back, though, to how you change the narrative, as you've put it. What is your personal approach here to building what I would call the personal confidence of people in these companies and in the public sector, who, by the way, are not exemplary employers in their own right by any means? Are there some tips you can give to people listening to us about how do you go about overcoming the kind of fear factor that I'm going to say the wrong thing? I was just talking to a colleague in Hong Kong who's blind, and I was saying to him, you know, you'll have managers worried that if they say, I'll see you tomorrow, oh, and you're blind, oh, you know, they just, and so I'm thinking of Simon Minty saying, you know, I don't care what you call me, just call me, right?
Yeah.
He's an entrepreneur. But there is all of that out there. So how do you tackle that?
I think for me, you know, I've got a unique ability to combine the different realities of where, you know, the audience that I'm engaging with. For example, I am a wheelchair user. I always have been. I have lived experience. I know the impact of barriers. I know the impact of accessibility and, good business. And as a customer who spends my money, I know what I'm looking for in a brand. So I can speak to it from this side, but I'm also an employer. I also have staff. I also understand strategy, productivity, profitability, and so on. And so for me, it's been able to recognize what some of the real fears are out there that are very much based on assumptions that don't need to be realized, that aren't going to be realized. But I also have poetic license as a person with a disability to get away with saying some things that perhaps I would be frowned upon saying had I not got the lived experience. So if there's one thing my parents taught me from a very young age, they said, as long as you've got a voice and a pointy finger, which is your particular strength, use it to change the world. And it's something that I've got a good sense of humor. And I find that when people can see the connection with a human being, where they start to see, I've got more in common with you than I actually realized, that this is not a new skill I'm teaching. Good leadership is about saying what's disabling my people and preventing them from being their most productive and committed selves. So I'm going to remove the disabling barrier through training them or upskilling them or giving them technology, or this is not a new skill. And so for me, it's really about my approach is to connect with human beings and say the only thing people with disabilities have in common is that we've got some kind of impairment that puts us at where we are right now in the world at a disabling disadvantage. We've got nothing else in common, unless they happen to also be a mother or a redhead or an MBA student or a South African. And that for me is the biggest tip that I would say. When this is not a big, overwhelming ask. It's not something that's going to be a huge expense and a major disruption to business. It's an evolution of change that starts off with going, well, based on what we're doing in business right now, we need to know what we don't know. So let's ask a few meaningful questions. And that is how any good business evolves to remain sustainable in response to the demands of its economy and its market.
And it's understanding the world in which you do business. Remember colleagues in Germany saying, we need to learn how to adapt for human reality.
Yeah, there it is.
There it is. And so, and I had a board member once who actually thought the business case, the business and ethical case for this stuff was, pretty far-fetched. And there was a day he looked at me and said, I think I get it. Impairment happens to you, like your dyslexia. Disability is what we do to you. Insist that you apply, but the form's inaccessible online, right?
Absolutely.
So impairment happens to you, disability is what we do to you. And lots of people with disabilities don't see that. They don't see the connections either. Well, fantastic. I think that's pretty much what I was hoping our conversation would be able to cover. I'm still intrigued by the complexity of the South African situation, but your ability to bring that experience into the European scene with your sense of humor, I think, delighted that you're here. I feel like I should be welcoming you to Europe. As a Canadian who lives in the UK, I don't quite know if I can do that. But thank you very much, Lesa Bradshaw.
Thank you, Susan. This has been great.
If you found this content relevant and perhaps even thought-provoking, please feel free to share with your networks.